All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. I am here with Dr. Sean Rafferty, who I'll give a better introduction to in a quick second. But I do want to make sure that this is working. This is my first time using this streaming software. And so if people could put into the chat, I know there's a lag, but if you could tell me that you can hear us fine. Sean, do you want to say something really quickly?
Hi, yeah, just I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Glad for everybody showed up.
Perfect. And so Sean is a professor of anthropology and archaeology at SUNY Albany, and he studies indigenous American archaeology, archaeobotany, intoxicants. Here, wait, I have some of his books up here. Everybody's saying good eye, and it looks like it's looking good. Let's share this. This is some of
Me.
Sean's books. Oh no, I hit the wrong button. Um, so he's written a series of books, and they're all fantastic. We'll be talking about mostly the one on the right, which just came out. This just came out this last month, right, Sean?
Yeah, it does. You've got the hard copy version there. It doesn't have the funky underwater Atlantean cover that
Ah,
the
I just grabbed
that
this
the
off of Amazon. So I
yeah.
don't know.
So that's what the soft cover looks like.
Okay. Yeah, and so we'll talk mostly about this last book, which just came out, Mythologizing the Past, Archaeology, History, and Ideology. And it's really about kind of mostly modern myths about the past and how they fit into, our world in the last, a lot of recent times, but also over the last 200 years or so. But he's also an author of another similar book that's Misanthropology, looking at pseudoscience more broadly in the field of anthropology, so including pseudo-archaeology, but also anthropology more heavily. And then some of his research focuses on native intoxicants of North America, which is a topic, as some of you might know, is a topic I'm really interested in. And I should have you back on at some point to discuss that more
It's happy to be here.
closely, because I've studied some of that stuff more in the Mediterranean context. Yeah, everybody says they can hear us and see us perfectly, so this is great. All right, we're set. Let's turn off this screen share then. So yeah, so we're using some new software here. We're trying to level up this channel a bit, so let's see how this goes. So we thought we'd talk about Atlantis a bit first. But actually, I want to know a bit about you. So you do a lot of archaeobotany and actual excavation and stuff like that. What got you into sort of thinking about the pseudoscience in the world around us in the fields of anthropology and archaeology?
What was my path towards radicalization? Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I mean, for me, it was weird. I mean, I was hired here at U Albany basically on the strength of my residue analysis research on tobacco. If you look at my early work, there's a lot of use of forensic chemistry technology to analyze pipe residue to identify how early tobacco was being used by indigenous American populations. That's what landed me this position. And I was quite happy here being an archaeologist running field schools and doing field research on indigenous North American native sites. I got tenure after 7 years in the program, and my wife gave me a present for getting tenure, and that was an iPod. If anybody remembers those, right? The
Oh
old
yeah.
school ones with the little mechanical wheel on it. And I'm kind of autistic, and I kind of like going around and always having information from like I was the guy who always would have CNN on or something back when that was still a usable resource. So I discovered podcasts right when I got this gadget, and
Ah.
that really quickly led me to familiarity with the field of scientific skepticism and critical thinking. Particularly, shout out to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and all of that area. The idea of a popular focused approach towards scientific rationality, consumer protection, and also a rigorous confrontation of pseudoscience in all sectors. That said, I also read. I'm sure you've talked to your audience about Kenny Fader's book, Frauds, Myths, and
Yeah, we
Mysteries.
had him on for a live stream during the Real
Terrific.
Archaeology event. Great.
I know Kenny a little
event,
bit
yeah.
more online, but I've met him in person. I read his book in college, and back in like probably like 1986, right? So that was that's always been kind of percolating in the back of my head. And eventually I was, I'd been in the program here long enough that I thought, well, I can actually turn some of this into a class. I started, now half of my teaching or more is teaching organized critical thinking and scientific skepticism to undergraduate classes. And I wanted to write a book. I'm better at writing books, it turned out, than the kind of focused research paper kind of model of academia. And I didn't want to redo Kenny's book. Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries is it's like in its 14th edition or something. So anyways, I didn't want to redo his thing. And I actually talked with him a little bit about it, and my first, not my first book, but the book that got me into the critical thinking in archaeology, Misanthropology. How is it different? Well, it takes the critical thinking angle, the skepticism angle, and focuses it purely on the study of anthropology, right? In those four subfields. Anyways, I guess it did okay, and the press liked it. So they actually, my editor asked, well, what else you got? And as I was talking about with you before we logged on, I left. If you look at Misanthropology, there are chapters at the end on ancient aliens, on the use of archaeology to forward nationalistic claims, and then on the use of archaeology in essentially racist colonial settings. There's nothing in there about the whole ancient civilization, lost continent, Atlantis kind of scene, because it wasn't particularly hot when I wrote the book. And right after I published it, Graham Hancock comes out with Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix, right? So I'm sort of kicking myself like, damn it, I missed an opportunity, but an opportunity came along because the editors asked, what else do you have? And I thought, well, I have an entire book in my head that's basically a big middle finger to Graham Hancock. And they thought, well, that's great. But there's more myths than just him, more than just Atlantis. What else can you fit in? And that's where the form of this book came about, to actually look at Atlantis is in there. It's the second chapter. But some of the other chapters look at other kinds of the misuse of history in ways that generally forward and support modern political structures. Not always, but most often, sort of a right-wing white nationalist kind of ideology. And that's been the path so far.
Here, wait, let me show everybody the table of contents so that you have a sense of it. There's 6 different chapters, and we'll cover Atlantis right now, since everybody knows I'm familiar with it and I'm writing a book on it as well. And then we also thought we'd talk about the Vikings a bit, because that's a really enduring, popular myth that has a big impact. And then, of course, I think I'm interested in hearing Sean's take on how cable TV has had an impact on the rise in some of these myths that we see. So that's kind of what we're hoping to talk about. So, all right, what's your take on Atlantis? I mean, to me, while I think you're right, I think in TV land, Atlantis was not super popular in, say, the middle of the 2010s when you were writing Misanthropology. It was very popular on the internet at that time.
Yeah.
So you have these kind of YouTubers that were growing. And then, as I also talked to you, I've seen kind of one of my research into this, I oftentimes use kind of engrams to track changes and trends over time. And let me pull up a few of those bad boys. This is from a lecture I gave yesterday at Northwestern University. So you can see, for example, this rise in the so what we're looking at is counts of terms and phrases in English language books that Google has in a database. And you can see this clear rise in the use of the term ancient aliens right when the TV show comes out on the History Channel, right? It's just like clear as day. That show comes out. people start writing about it in books. And you can also see the earlier rise, of course, in Ancient Astronaut that's connected
Yep.
with Eric von Daniken.
Yep.
And so what's interesting to me is, what's one of these that's kind of clean? No, I guess this one's kind of clean. Well, just pay attention to the blue line. That's the line for Atlantis going back to the year 1800. And
Right.
you can see how there's a spike right here in the 1880s. And that's really
That's
closely
Donnelly.
related to
Yeah.
Ignatius Donnelly and his best-selling book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian Civilization. And then it kind of fades off a little bit. And then in the 1920s, it picks up in a big way. And I think that has to do with like Edward Casey
Yep.
and like other sort of attributions of Atlantis at that time. And then there's just kind of the steady rise from the 60s onwards, which I would think has to do with archaeologists who are promoting this idea of Akrotiri and Santorini, the island
Yep.
in the Aegean that was destroyed by a volcano. But then, boom, right here is the big modern rise. And that's really in the late 80s, early 90s into about 2000, the early 2000s, when you see this huge interest in Atlantis in English language books. And so I've always thought of that kind of as a Graham Hancock impact, but you made a compelling argument for the influence of cable TV on a lot of these pseudo-scientific, pseudo-historical narratives. And so I was just sort of wondering how we could think about, what do you think about interpreting this graph? Does anything stick out to you besides what I was sort of thinking through?
I'm wondering. I guess there's that big burst for Ur going on there, right when some of the
When Leonard Woolley
excavations
and stuff are doing excavations there. Yeah, exactly.
we're going on there.
And then the
Yeah.
early stuff at Pompeii with August
Yep,
Mal
yep.
and
When
others.
they've
Yeah,
got
exactly. Yeah.
they've got all of that going on. But yeah, I mean, of course, the difference is that Stonehenge, the Acropolis, Sphinx, Ur, and Pompeii are all like real places where you can actually go there and see the excavations and so forth. Whereas Atlantis is purely conceptual, despite people's repeated attempts to find it. Over every time you find a site that's wet, then it's the real Atlantis or something.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this was my point when I give lectures, is that Atlantis it's actually more popular than most real archaeological sites. And so
Right.
it's actually kind of very humbling as an archaeologist to start to realize, whoa, people are far more familiar with Atlantis than
Yeah.
with any other archaeological site out there, or even like major Greek historical figures, right? Like Alexander the Great is mentioned less commonly than Atlantis in today's books. And this is a modern phenomenon. You can see this really happens fairly recently, where Atlantis is becoming much more popular and overtaking all this kind of real history and real archaeology in the public imagination. And I mean, some of this has to do with fiction, right? Some of
Sure.
these books
And there's
track
the
fiction
Disney
and
movie, or
nonfiction.
was it a Disney
Yeah,
movie? Or
yeah,
animated movie, anyways, I think. But yeah,
yeah.
I mean, my point was that obviously the internet, is a big issue, a big venue for the spread of pseudoscience. But the point I make in the book is that the internet was sort of pouring gasoline on fires that had already been lit back well beforehand. And even farther back, I mean, I mentioned cable news, but the idea of people realizing that pseudoscience was a marketable product goes back even before that. Someone
For sure.
I saw Cloud Dragon Arts mentioned Mr. Spock's TV show, Leonard Nimoy's hosting of In Search of, back in the 70s, which I was kind of riveted by at the time. Then, of course, Hancock's book, didn't directly deal with Atlantis, but it started, it scratched the same itch. But what cable TV did, I think, was it provided an opportunity for everybody to kind of subscribe to their own reality, right? Like you prior to that, there were two things. One, there were only like four. Flint and I are old enough to remember when there were only four channels, right? There's the main networks, and then maybe UHF if you live near a city, and then of course public broadcasting. So what's the effect of that? Everybody's kind of on the same page in terms of the availability of information, and there's a lot of gatekeeping of what gets broadcast. Especially, there are books, but how many people actually read regularly? A lot of them we're still getting a lot of their information from a screen. It wasn't a very representative shared concept. It was a very white male patriarchal cultural construct, but at least we were all on the same page, right? We all had the same reality. We all lived under the same colored sky. And then with cable TV, you know, suddenly education becomes edutainment. Initially, there was kind of a brief golden age of, oh, you're into archaeology. Well, here's John Rhys Davies talking about archaeology, and you know, oh, you're into ancient fossil animals. You know, we can look at I forget the name of the show. Paleo World was the show where you can, you know, see probably some pretty tired looking CGI reconstructions of ancient animals and so forth. But really quickly, people realized that basically selling appealing pseudoscientific nonsense sold a lot more ad revenue than real edutainment. And you know, people, and you start to see the rise of what we now see. You know, how many of those shows on the Discovery Network are now showing like basically reality TV, rampant pseudoscience. For a while, it was like everything about World War II and Nazis all the time. And you know, I'm a war, not like a war fan, but like I'm a military history buff, so I was okay with that. That's when my wife started calling the History Channel the Hitler Channel.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But you know, that really started a situation where you had. I mean, it used to be if you had weird beliefs about the past, you had to like subscribe to somebody's newsletter or go to conferences or something. It wasn't really easy. It was like a disease, you know. There was not a lot of opportunity for cross infections, and this was the beginning of the foundation of these echo chambers and these sort of populations of people who can spread this information through the public at large. And then, of course, the internet comes along in the late 90s, and it's you know, kind of all she wrote. Certainly, things exploded after that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think certainly, like even just going back to some of these engrams, if we compare it not to archaeology, but even if you just compare it to this archaeology, you can see that it has an enduring popularity. Maybe it's not as popular as most real archaeological sites in the 19th century, but it's pretty dang close, right? And so if we, on the other hand, go back to comparing it to pseudoscientific terms, so things like astrology or conspiracy theories like JFK's assassination or UFO or creationism, or notice how far down Ancient Aliens is. Like Ancient Aliens, you know, when you're talking about Ancient Aliens being popular in the 90s or in the middle 2010s, not in books. And so, you know, if you look at these books, Atlantis is really, in many ways, it has this enduring popularity, and it's one of the most popular conspiracy theories out there. In many ways. And I mean, you discussed it in your book. I've discussed it before, as have others. There's a lot of surveys of the Americans and others that show that belief in Atlantis or a similar lost civilization from a long time ago is about 50% of people. And so there really is it's very popular, if you see what I mean. And it goes back in time. It's not a new popular thing, even if it is increasing in popularity right now. It's always been fairly popular, if you see what I mean. And that's, I think, is part of what makes it so popular today, is that sort of intellectual history, if you will, or pseudo-intellectual history, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, one of the things I think that your chapter on Atlantis did very well is it walked through that transition from the allegory of Plato, which, I mean, look, even scholars in the 19th and 18th century, they knew that this was an allegory. Anybody that is quite familiar with the entire body of Plato's texts, there's a lot of really key tells in how he sets it up that relates to other stories that he sets up that are false. You know, that
was his MO anyways. That's how Plato wrote, you know, like telling these allegorical and he was sort of the best at it maybe, but he wasn't necessarily the first either to do so. And this was also at a time when like reading Plato was something you would do in just regular going to school, right? It wasn't like, you know, a niche interest for philosophy majors or something like that, where
I mean,
just part of a liberal education. So yeah, it was known.
Even into the Renaissance, he was known. He was actually one of the few pagan authors that
Yep.
Christians adopted. He was known as the
Plato,
divine
Aristotle.
philosopher, and so he was very, very popular. Everybody read Plato. I mean, I even read some Plato in high school. I read
Sure, sure.
part of the Republic, if I remember, in like 11th grade or something. And so this was, back in the dark ages of the 1990s. And so, so everybody's kind of familiar with Plato. In fact, if I was to put Plato up on those engrams, he's more popular than Atlantis, which makes sense
Okay.
because if you mention Atlantis, you have to mention Plato. So he's
Sure.
mentioned every time Atlantis is mentioned, plus all these other mentions of him. But but yeah, even his dialogues themselves are fictional. He
Right.
has fictional characters in there. He has dialogues that could never have happened because they have people that never met.
They weren't alive at the same time.
Yeah, which includes the Timaeus and the Critias, by
Right.
the way, the Atlantis dialogue. If you delve into those characters, there's no way they could have met. But
Right.
it's that kind of popularity in the early modern period that I think is really interesting. I mean, so a lot of your book is about trying to understand the ideology of these modern myths. What do you make of this kind of growing popularity and thoughts on Atlantis kind of in like after the Renaissance, I guess, late Renaissance and then early Enlightenment periods? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's kind of two paths. I mean, there are people who know I think they're not ignorant, and they're well educated, and they know that it's not a true story, that's not the facts of the past, and yet they recognize a sellable product, and they cynically see something that they can market and so forth. I think I have suspicions that the key member behind the current popularity of this is of that category, but it's also a real easy way to kind of write your own history onto the history of the world, right? It's a way, it's like where is this? I look at like civilization like a football, right? And where did civilization get started? Well, of course, the Atlanteans started it first, and then they handed it off to the Egyptians, who only had it for a little bit and built some pyramids before they gave it to the Greeks, and then the Greeks, of course, gave it to the Romans, and the Romans gave it to us, right? So us being white Europeans in the Renaissance and so forth. So it's a way of looking at the history of the world and putting yourself continually at the end of this kind of this teleological development leading towards Renaissance and Enlightenment European thinkers. And who does that write out? I mean, this is not a new point that I make. I mean, Fader talks about this in his Atlantis chapter, and throughout Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, and others have said it as well. It leaves out the fact that the vast majority of what we call civilization of ancient state societies were what would be considered under today's ethnological terms people of color, non-Caucasian, non-white, non-European, pick your term, right? Where is this happening? It's happening in Central America. It's happening in South America. It's happening in China. It's happening in the Indian subcontinent. It's happening in the Near East, right? The Atlantis myth makes if you'll forgive the term, kind of a Trojan horse to take a basically kind of a white supremacist myth and package it in a way that is palatable and seems it has the veneer of factual. It has the veneer of almost kind of truthy factuality to it, and there are well credentialed people, not necessarily experts in anthropology or even history, but learned people who are and have been associated with it. So I think, again, it makes a pretty good the spoonful of sugar that helps the ethnocentric medicine go down.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I mean, to me, I kind of link it more directly with colonialism than specifically, especially in the earlier periods. Like, you're talking about like the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and even into the 19th century with Donnelly, it's very much linked with colonialism and claims to land. So like Pierre Vidal-Naquet in his book Atlantis and the Nations, I was trying to pull it up, but his other book is showing up. He goes through this in a lot of detail. where he talks about the ways that the Spanish crown
Hmm.
uses sort of the Atlantis story and other Greek myths like the Hesperides
Hmm.
as ways to claim land in the New World,
Right.
right? And so at
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same
No,
time,
we're
yeah,
not taking Mexico. We're taking Mexico back. You know.
yeah, exactly. It's what our ancestors, in a sense, had, and these myths prove that. And so you can also see that in early American U.S. history,
Yep. The mound
with the
builders and
connection, of
whatnot.
course,
Yeah.
between lost civilizations.
Yep.
Sometimes this mound builder civilization is Atlantis, sometimes it isn't. But it's directly referenced by Andrew Jackson in his
Right.
address in his State of the Union to Congress, the year
That's
that the
in
Indian
yeah,
Removal Act is
that's
passed.
also in the book as well.
Yeah.
There's the chapter America's BC, which is a play on Barry Fell's America BC, and again, it's not who was in America first besides the indigenous people, and as I say, early America must have been a pretty crowded place because there's a lot of everybody was there, but a lot of the stories are basically ideological fig leaves for colonialism of various sorts.
Yeah, and to claim actual land, and
Right.
and what's interesting, I find, as a historian who studies ancient myths, which Atlantis is not. Atlantis is a philosophical allegory, and I have a whole chapter in the book that I'm writing on this, on why it's not a myth and
Right.
how we understand the archaeology of Greek mythology and the history of Greek mythology and how it differs.
Right.
But the point is that many Greek myths were also established to have claims to land and territory,
Right.
either by families or by city states or by various groups. And so this is not a new phenomenon of creating myths to have
Oh, I mean,
justify.
myths
You
are an
know.
expression of ideology, and
Hmm.
ideology is the main way in which humans justify whatever their status quo happens to be at the time, and using myths to justify various kind of land claims is it's not a new game,
No,
to be
not at all.
sure.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, I would think that we should be thinking of a lot of myths in general from the past to today as sort of through this kind of cynical lens, because there's oftentimes a material reason that such a myth is so attractive that it spreads, right?
Yep.
And
Well,
so,
like
yeah.
I know you'd mentioned talking about the Vikings, but like my entry into that topic was talking in my previous book, Misanthropology, talking about the Kensington Runestone,
Yeah.
which supposedly is a 14th century runic document documenting the trials and tribulations of a party of Norse explorers in the Midwest in the 1300s, and is in fact a 19th century forgery, which you can prove based on linguistic grounds. That's why it was in my
Hmm.
first book as an expression of using language to perpetuate pseudoscience. But the more and more I got. And why was Kensington so popular and so readily believed? Because it takes land, Minnesota, that is today and at the time in the 1800s widely populated by people of Scandinavian descent, and it's like, again, we're not coming new to this land. We're coming back to where our ancestors have already been and have already bled for this land. The stone tells the story of Norse explorers being killed by indigenous people, right? So it's very pithy and it's a very focused, the idea of the indigenous people as being almost the other of their own land, and the Europeans being really the real actors who are the heroes of the story, being acted against by the indigenous people who were in fact, as time would go on, we're by this point in the 1800s long-standing victims I mean, the kindest you can say is ethnic cleansing, and the terms get worse from there, right? So again, that is a colonialist document trying to justify the occupation of colonized land.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, and not just and like I think that's interesting, the idea that what it does is it paints indigenous people in such a negative light because it shows
Right.
them as these evil savages, right? And so that's the same thing with many descriptions of these mound builder civilizations. It was the modern indigenous people, the modern Native Americans that obliterated this lost civilization. They
Right.
were the ones that destroyed it, which of course then gives justification to treat them harshly. And so yeah, it's a real issue, this kind of flipping of things. And I find that flipping so ironic for Atlantis as well, because if you read, you know, Plato's description of Atlantis in the Timaeus and the Critias, it is not a utopia. It is a
No, yeah,
dystopia. It is the
they're the
bad
bad guys.
guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
I mean, what did
only with
Kenny likens them to the Empire in Star Wars, right?
yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah.
Athens is the Republic, the Rebel Alliance in that.
Hmm.
I mean the whole point is again, it was an ideological statement about how great Athens was and how great the ideal kind of civilization of Athenian society was, using Atlantis as a foil, I suspect, for the Persian Empire.
Well,
But
so it's complicated. So Greek historians and philosophers that look at this, in a sense, both sides are Athens.
yeah,
So the Athens, meaning Athens in the story, the ideal
hmm
city, is in a sense the Athenians when they are small and they are defeating the Persian
so it's
invaders,
what Athens
right?
could be as opposed to what Athens was.
Well, and
At
so
the
then at the
Even
same
that's
time, many of the
complicated.
descriptions of Atlantis, they match on very well not only to the Persian Empire, which was this invading force, but they
Hmm
also map on really well to the Athenian Empire and how they overextended their
Right.
imperialism in a sense in the 5th century. And then it's especially tied into when Plato was writing it. It was right at the time the Second Athenian Empire was being formed, and the Athenians had this kind of new set of imperial ambitions. And most Plato and others at the time, Isocrates, he was an orator who gave speeches against the Second Athenian Empire, and him and Plato were writing similar texts, trying to warn the Athenians of the 4th century not to make the mistakes of the Athenians that had their earlier empire that the Spartans beat in the Peloponnesian War. So it was kind of like a warning to people at that time, hey, model yourself off your great great grandparents, not your parents and grandparents,
Right.
because your great great grandparents, they were successful. They understood how to govern yourselves in these ideal ways, while those that overstepped their bounds with imperialism, that was problematic. So it's kind of like that scene from Star Wars, if you want to go back to the Star Wars
hmm
analogy, where Luke Skywalker is fighting himself, if you see what I
Yes.
mean, with the
Yes.
dark side and the light side. And so you see that really clearly. And the Athenian audience would have picked up on these clues really, really clearly, you know, because it's really made quite bluntly. Like Sarah Brody, she's a scholar that has published on this extensively. She's just like, if you understand Athenian thought at that time, to think that they would not recognize this as a very obvious and overt allegory is just
Right.
ridiculous. Like it's like openly right there, these kind of analogies, and they're really, really loud and obvious to anyone who's familiar with Athenian history, if you will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially for groups that grew up, in with Athenian or Greek theater and stuff, where they're used to that. Allegory and metaphor was the common way of transmitting information at the time, as opposed to the kind of more bang people over the head bluntly kind of approach that we've adopted in modern culture.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, and actually, that's actually one of my fun things that I like to share as well. Sorry, I'm pulling up a couple slides from yesterday. Where was it? So part of this is part and parcel where it's introduced after the Republic, and one of the key points in the Republic is this idea that politicians should invent myths to
Hmm
teach people good behavior. And so
hmm
we call that today the noble lie. It's Plato's noble lie.
hmm
And there's this long discussion over it. And Plato, of course, he always invents these myths, the myth of the allegory of the cave. We have so many of these. The ring of Gyges, which, by the way, J.R.R. Tolkien's ring that makes you invisible is based off of the ring of Gyges told in the Republic. Um, and
Interesting.
so but the noble lie at the end of this conversation between Socrates and Plato's brother Glaucon, Socrates says, well, how, here, wait, let me share my screen. How how then could we devise a useful noble lie? It would certainly take a lot of persuasion to convince people to believe in it. And Glaucon says, I don't think we can convince anyone today, but maybe their children and later generations might believe such a story. And that's where we're at right now. We are those later generations who are believing this kind of allegory that Plato created, because we're not familiar with the context unless you're a student of Greek philosophy and
Right.
Greek history and Athenian history. And so, that's what I find fascinating, is this transition. So how else? So let's fast forward, I guess, to today, because we've sort of
Sure.
covered some of colonialism, and obviously there's the whole dark history of Nazis, which we could get into. But I think, well, how is this? Someone asked up above. Where was it? I saw it. I said I'd reply to it. Let me see if I can find the thing. Maybe not. Can we search these? Oh, here it is. Devil's advocate, is there any harm in people being interested in, say, Hancock or modern Atlantis narratives in today's world? So what's your take on this? You obviously talk about this quite a bit in the book.
I mean, not surprisingly, I do find that harmful, and there's a couple of ways. I mean, pseudoscience in general can be broadly harmful in kind of two ways, right? There are pseudoscientific, irrational beliefs that may seem harmless, right? Like, I don't know, belief in astrology or something like that. Okay, if Nana wants to learn if Mercury is retrograde today, who gives a damn, right? But Nana's learning how to make decisions in her life. Well, I say it's like the epistemological nose of the camel coming into your tent. Eventually, the whole camel's gonna come in. You leave the door open to irrational causation, and you're teaching yourself a irrational, non-evidence-based mode of thinking, and it starts in one, and the slope really is slippery, and it does actually lead, I think pretty inexorably towards eventually actively harmful things. Look at it as a gateway drug, if you will. But then there are also beliefs that are directly harmful. If you're just putting it in a modern context, if you have sort of a modern anti-establishment ideology that's leading you to embrace vaccine denialism or something like that, the obvious extremely negative effects for you and for society. So what are the effects of believing in Hancock's thing? I mean, for one, you're attributing the actions of real people to somebody else, right? Who built the pyramids, right? African Egyptians built the pyramids. And by saying that was actually some pale second last gasp of a dying civilization of magical white people from the ocean, I think is kind of a crappy thing to do to the descendants of a culture from a part of the planet that, let's just say, has not had the easiest history in the world, right? So that's one, and secondly, as I mentioned before, I mean, most of it, you don't have to scratch many of these stories, whether it's Vikings or whether it's Atlantis or whether it's the ancient Aryans or whomever, before really repugnant white supremacist ideals are never very far away, right? Like, I bet myself, how far into studying the Kensington Stone do I have to get before I hit white nationalism in a Google search? And I think I made it like 3 or 4 pages before, like Aryan Nation and Stormfront were using it as an example of, look, our people have always been here. So, is Graham Hancock the same as the people who are marching in Washington at the moment? No, I'm not going to say that, but he's giving them ammunition that they can use to proffer the kinds of really racist arguments that are sadly and increasingly part of at least the American national discourse for the past decade.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's part of the issue is like, look, 50% of people believe in this idea, at least
Right.
at a casual level. So it's not like everybody who believes in it is some outright white supremacist, terrible person. That's certainly not the case.
No, I
But
don't mean to say that,
but there's two issues here. One is the history of this idea is tied up into the removal of people from their land, as we just
yeah,
talked about. And it's also, which we did not talk about, we glossed over, it's tied up very closely with certain brands of Nazism. And so if you start believing in this idea and you start researching it, you quickly brush up against those far more offensive and subversive type
yeah,
beliefs.
yeah. I mean,
Just like if you, same thing with the anti-intellectualism. There's this anti-intellectualism, which is, it's not good. Obviously, Graham Hancock is out there just crapping all over me and you and other people that we know. But at the same time,
I
what
think I'm
that
on his
also
radar
can,
yet. I hope to
okay.
get crapped on by Graham Hancock. That's what I know. That's when I know I'll finally have made it.
But
Maybe
what
this
that
will do
leads
it today.
Yeah, but what that leads to, and he's very overt about this when you listen to him on podcasts, he's like, it's a good thing that people don't trust scholars right now. I've been talking about that for 30 years. He said this on, several podcasts. And so, what that leads to is a disbelief in other forms of science and other forms of
Right.
scholarship to not take that seriously. So, I hate the logic of slippery slope, but if you do start researching this, it's really there. And you can see this because as soon as people become enamored with this, that's the direction their research will start going. And
When
so,
I talk about slippery slopes in my critical thinking class, I say obviously that's a very popular fallacy, but sometimes the slope it's not so much a slippery slope as sometimes there is an active force pushing you
yeah,
down the slope, and the fact that people profit off of the decrease of the popularity of critical thinking as critical thinking and just awareness of science goes down, that makes people vulnerable to being manipulated by various actors,
yeah,
and anti-intellectualism. I mean, there was a public platform for a major political party in a major American state that explicitly said we are against the teaching of upper level critical thinking skills to America's school children, right? And ignorant, uncritical populace is, they're the sheep. They're the ones who really are easy to manipulate, and these folks will push people along that slope. So I don't have a pithy phrase for that. I still say slippery slope, but it's not quite the right thing.
yeah. And I mean, but it is sort of. I know what you mean. Yeah, yeah. And so I don't know. One of the things that I've been trying to think through, especially as I do more YouTubing and podcasting and writing for the general public, and not necessarily for colleagues and for people that have taken that are, say, majors in archaeology, right? Because very few people in the end take university level archaeology or
Right.
history. And it's just A, half the people don't go to university. B, most of the people that go to university don't take many of those classes.
Right.
And so, and obviously, the state of education in primary school through high school is variable, right? And so, and even at top schools, they're still learning fairly out of date type stuff that's presented in a very simplistic, not nuanced sort of fashion. That's why people think of history as memorizing people and dates.
Right.
And
One damn
so,
thing after another.
yeah, and so what I've realized is, the reality is most people in the general public, they believe pseudo history. And I
Yep.
mean, if you go pick up Joe Hedwig Steinhuis's recent book, 101 Fake Historical Facts, I have
Hmm.
an episode coming out with her soon.
Oh, great.
I I did not know that all these things were fake history, right? And I'm a historian.
Right. It's your
But like,
and it's
and
your
so
job to know.
it's so pervasive, so many of these myths that like I feel like we need to start thinking through how we address the public and make sure we recognize that these ideas are fairly popular. So we
Yeah.
can't always address it as if it's just like known that it's not true. If you see what I mean.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's partly why. I mean, my father refers to me as a recovering archaeologist because like I don't actually teach a lot of actual archaeology here at U Albany at this point. I do for my graduate students and occasionally, but mostly I'm kind of a full-time teacher of critical thinking skills in general, right? And my little class of 20 people is now 200 people in a theater. And the whole point is basically teaching people how not to get fooled by various kinds of BS, of learning the skills of critical thinking. And I talk about pseudo-archaeology as one example of that, but there's a lot of other stuff that I thought was much more like, is it going to matter to your average graduate that the League of I don't know, Levana points were after 1300 AD in the Eastern Woodlands? It's probably not going to come up, but recognizing everybody is Graham Hancock's hugely popular, there must be something going on there. That to not recognize a very basic argument from popularity as a logical fallacy, that kind of skill set is going to be widely applicable in many settings. So that's kind of my my passion right now in teaching.
Do you want to give an answer then to Franklin's question here? I'll give one, but you start. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the very basic one is where's I like to make a distinction between fact, whether something is true or not, which very often we don't necessarily know because the information is fragmentary and it can lead in lots of different directions, especially in archaeology. So I talk about learn to understand the idea of plausibility. Given what we already know about archaeology, how likely is something like Atlantis to be true? I mean, we already have remains of cultures that are 10, 15,000 years old, and universally across the planet, they're all very small scale, hunter forager, minimal material culture, people wearing skins with tools made out of sticks and stuff. And I mean that in no way to denigrate, that people who lived those adaptations. That was the world at that time, right? And we found that evidence, right? So we know we can find evidence that far back. How likely is it that something of the scale of Atlantis could have existed and yet leaves no evidence whatsoever? Okay, I mean, we can find stuff under the water now. We found sites that are submerged. We found the Titanic. We could find Atlantis if it was there. We have not, ergo, it's almost certainly not. Right. So that's the kind of skill set that I try to teach students. Does it pass a smell test, as it were?
I get asked this question reasonably frequently. How can someone, so part of my spiel sometimes is that it takes expertise and experience to actually really recognize when a claim is fraudulent or false or way out there and not even plausible. Right. And so I use some examples from AI sometimes when I talk to the public or whatnot. Here, I could try to pull one up. So sorry, this is all again from my stupid lecture. I like this one. So one of my favorite things I like to use, this is not AI. This is actual ancient statues. So these are two statues of Socrates from the ancient Greek world, both in famous museums. And I mean, Sean, are they depicting the same person?
Part of my neurodivergence involves face blindness. So
I'm asking the wrong person
on the planet. You could ask that question.
Yeah,
I look at that and I see bald guy with beard. Same guy.
Yeah,
could be you. I don't know.
Art historians would say that they're depicting the same person. So if you have many statues, all of Socrates depicting the same face with the same beard, the same balding, the same eyes, the same nose, etc., does that mean that this is what Socrates looked like?
You could do the same thing with Mickey Mouse, though, right?
Yeah, well, you could, but here we know Socrates was real, right? We have also, and so what we actually know for sure that this is not depicting Socrates. And the reason we know that is because These statues are from much later. We have descriptions of what Socrates looked like from people who knew him very well. Plato,
Hmm.
Xenophon, Aristophanes, and they describe him very differently. As Professor Deborah Nails, who's written biographies on Socrates, says, he was really ugly. He resembled
Right.
a satyr more than a man, and he does not resemble anything like the statues that show up later in ancient times and now are on internet sites and on books. Instead, he had wide-set, bulging eyes that darted sideways and enabled him to see like a crab. What was not straight ahead, but what was beside him as well. And he had a flat, upturned nose with flaring nostrils and large, fleshy lips like an ass. So why do all these statues look alike? Well, you need to actually understand art history to recognize that these are all later Roman copies of a
Hmm.
famous bronze statue by a famous sculptor named Lysippus, who also sculpted Alexander the Great and whatnot. And he was born after Socrates died. But he made the most famous statue of him,
Right.
and that's what ended up getting copied in marble all over the ancient Roman world. And so that's where it takes a certain level of expertise to really be able to sometimes tell whether something is plausible or not. And so it's one of the things I've realized based on how many people believe in things like Atlantis and Graham Hancock and whatnot, that that's not always so simple for somebody who doesn't understand a lot of the knowledge and experience that we have. So what
And
I've gone towards is a different sniff test, if you will. And
sure.
what that is the person only appealing to the public and not
Hmm.
to people who actually have their hands on that knowledge? If somebody is appealing to the public rather than engaging
Yeah.
with people who are familiar with evidence,
In fact,
well,
intentionally
screw
avoiding,
them.
the
Yeah.
expertise. I mean, I tell students, okay, fine, you're not an expert in archaeology. There's not that many of us who are, frankly, in the broad scheme. Look for the consensus. What does the
Yes.
consensus of experts tell you? And it doesn't, at this point, am I a climate scientist? No, I am not. But I do realize that 97, 98% of climate scientists agree in anthropogenic climate change as being, a real phenomenon. And yeah, there's always going to be some residual of heterodox people who are saying something different for various reasons. But what does the majority of experts on a given topic, has a consensus emerged? Is the consensus always right? No. But
No,
most
and
of it,
that's also the difference between a pseudoscientist and a scientist. There are scientists that disagree with the consensus, usually on fairly minute, specific things,
right,
and they are publishing papers actively targeting their colleagues, right? Just like all the archaeologists that were the first advocates of pre-Clovis, they were
right,
not going to the public and saying,
right.
all my colleagues hate me, they disagree with
Yeah,
stuff, I'm
Clovis
presenting this to
Mafia and
you.
Steve Van
No,
Canes and all of those
yeah,
guys
no,
would tear you apart, ruin your career.
yeah, they kept publishing articles and books for their colleagues. They kept presenting to their colleagues, and they eventually changed the consensus by convincing their colleagues that they were right.
Of
And
course, the
so,
difference is in this case, they actually had, in the end of the day, they had fairly convincing physical evidence to support their argument, as opposed to anybody arguing for the truth of pseudoscientific claims.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so that's, I don't know, that's sort of how I try to make it simplified for the public, is that's one. The other thing, of course, that ties into that is the claims of being canceled. Like the
Right, right.
stigmatized language where
When
as soon
in
as
when
someone
in
says,
doubt, claim victimhood.
I'm being canceled, it's like, screw you, that's just rhetoric. Being canceled in today's world is just a way of getting more attention.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like, yeah, so
The
so I don't know.
intolerant leftists are canceling me like that.
Yeah. So I don't know. We never got to the Vikings. We're about an hour in. Tell me if you want to go to the Vikings really quickly, maybe for a less overt version of pseudoscience, or you want to.
Yeah, like I said, I got involved in that. Again, I'm not a Viking archaeologist, although I have friends who are. But I got into the idea of the Vikings are one of those popular actors in a lot of historical myths. Um, they and we project our own kind of idealized society onto them, as if they were almost some kind of they're almost kind of like the Aryan supermen of the ancient world. They went everywhere. They had superior technology. They were merciless and unbeatable in battle. They were, of course, manly Caucasian men with beards and horned helmets and swords and all of that kind of stuff. When in fact they were actually a very cosmopolitan group that wouldn't even have recognized modern ethnic categories as being even relevant. They actually, anytime they came in contact with a standing Western army, after they got, if you look at like Viking mobs going, yeah, okay, fine, you sacked Paris, but then Charlemagne, pretty much cleaned house on that. Their weapons technology was not substantially better than the weapons of the time. There's nothing magical about a Viking sword. In fact, Frankish French weapons were seen as being, the standard of the day. And yet, there's something that we love to mythologize around the Vikings. Again, to bring up the Nazis, there was a lot of cash spent by the Anherb, funded initially through Heinrich Himmler, to try to bring Scandinavian archaeologists into the German fold in order to make this myth of Nordicism as if, as a way of kind of glomming on to the Scandinavian history and making that, it's almost, your guys are great, you're almost Germans, come and be part of our ideological shtick. And you see that all the way through today. If you look at the videos from like the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, there are, dudes with white supremacist banners carrying mock-ups of Viking shields, right? Or
horns,
Viking,
yeah.
Viking.
Which, by the way, the horned
QAnon
helmets, by the
shaman.
way, are not Viking. The horned helmets are a modern attribution to them. That's also in Joe's.
Yeah, doesn't that
Viking
come
history
from like Wagner and
yeah,
stuff?
exactly.
Right? Yeah,
And
no,
it's also funny
the
that
idea that very popular white supremacist tattoos are often various kinds of Viking symbols, or things that kind of feel Viking-y but aren't really, so that's kind of my take on that particular myth.
Yeah, no, I think that that's important. I think the way we mythologize this, and I think also your point about that kind of Nordic superiority, if you will, that even ties into Atlantis. In the 17th century, there was a scholar, Olaus Rudbeck, who believed Atlantis was in Scandinavia, in Sweden, I think. And so, so there's a lot of this claims of that's tied into the Thule Society in Nazi Germany and before, and it's just like, yeah, it's part and parcel, like you said today, of these subcultures that I guess are becoming more mainstream over time. Yeah.
Can I respond real quickly to a listener?
Yeah, which one?
Avery Wilson, 1458. Yes. Great question, Avery, and sadly the answer is, at least in my experience, is there's very little attention to critical thinking skills in earlier school levels. In fact, even in the high school and college level, I hear a lot of people saying, we're going to teach you how to think, not what to think. And yet the old model of, cracking open their head and pouring information into it, and expecting that to somehow magically transmute itself into someone who can rationally investigate new knowledge, still is, at least it's not as prominent as it was, but it's still a lot of people going back to that. And that is another reason why I've kind of made that, like, I can't change the world, but I can maybe change my little corner of it. And that's kind of why I teach the bits that I do.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what I'm trying to do online and with my books and stuff like that, is to try to get that across from the perspective of archaeology and history, of course, and to popularize it a little bit. One of my big goals, of course, is to make it kind of fun and entertaining, because if it's not fun and entertaining, people ain't going to eat it.
It helps to be funny and interesting,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I've gotten to be a fairly popular teacher at U Albany because I get up on a stage and I wave my arms and I curse and stuff like that. And I put on a good show, but at the end of the day, the point is to try to make human beings better consumers of knowledge in my little corner of the world.
Yeah, and that relates, I think, to this other question that came up earlier about the issue of burden of proof. And I think that that's really important on sort of like an upper level, like a scholarly
Yeah.
sort of level. You need proof to really suggest something,
If you're going to
especially,
make a
yeah.
claim, you better bring the receipts to back it up. Or,
And
as
I mean,
said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
yeah, and like so much of pseudoscience is about trying to show how you can't prove them wrong, rather than
Right.
bringing
That's
any
not how it
actual
works.
evidence. Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, this is one of my big points that I especially try to get across to colleagues, is in the public sphere. I actually think telling someone who's a pseudoscientist or a believer of pseudoscience, show me your evidence, meaning show me your proof, what that does is it invites them to speak or write or whatever, and just kind of start gish galloping with a stream of not real proof, but what looks and sounds kind of like proof.
Right,
And
and people
so,
don't know the difference, which is
yeah,
why, where that's where I say that in most circumstances, I would generally advise to not engage. And I actually have in class, there's like a series of circumstances where you should engage with a pseudoscientist, like if it's your job, if their health is at risk for whatever it is they believe in, then you've got a moral obligation. Don't take essential oils for your cancer, grandma, that kind of thing. Or if there are people watching the debate who might be carried along to the truthful, rational side, and in almost any other situation, all you're doing is elevating them,
yeah,
you're leaning into that false balance that the media creates all the time, where they might have, you and Graham Hancock do not belong on the same stage, right? You are not the same,
he
right?
is far more popular than me. It's true.
I get that, and that's because of people putting, platforming bullshit, and that's just really problematic. And yeah, we have to be one, be willing to engage, and most scholars aren't. Okay, the structure of academia does not reward most of us for doing so. Okay, and most of us aren't trained at it and aren't very good at it. I mean, say what you want about Graham, he's great on camera,
Oh,
and
he's great. Yeah.
he's articulate and he's charismatic. He writes reasonably well. He's full of shit, but all of the things that I just said. I'm sorry, I don't know if you're supposed to curse on your show, but
Oh, you're fine.
but
Yeah,
yeah, that's more of us need to be willing to take on that task, and that is also something which is in the conclusion of the recent book.
yeah. And I mean, so my take, since I do engage, is always punch up.
Yeah,
Meaning, do not amplify small beans. It's not worth
they're
it.
victims as much as anything else. A lot of
Yeah.
them just literally don't know any better, and they've been hoodwinked.
But even
And
like smaller influencers, it's
sure,
not worth to mention them unless you really have to. I've had to in a few cases, but I try
yeah,
to focus on the ones that are really, really popular because I don't
yeah,
want to make another influencer more popular.
fair
Um,
enough. Yeah,
Second of all, I do think, though, as a field, we have to engage within the milieu of these really popular topics because, as I pointed out earlier, we are the ones with the expertise and the experience to
yeah,
actually address these topics. There's nobody else out there. We can't rely on journalists who don't have degrees in our field and have experience to do that for us. We could work with them, but we can't rely on them. And same with amateur YouTubers and podcasters
yeah,
and whatnot. We really need to start taking the reins here. And I think that it's also an opportunity for us, like a lot, we always say, well, all these bad actors are using that kind of phrase, no publicity or any publicity is good publicity. Well, that can work for us too. look,
Sure.
everybody's really interested in Atlantis right now. If we start talking a little bit more about the relationship between Atlantis and use that as a jumping off point to teach people about how real archaeology and real historical research
Right.
works
Right.
on interesting topics, that's a net gain for our field. It's a net
Yeah.
gain for humanity in
Indiana
general.
Jones is a
So,
terrible model for archaeology, but he was a boon to archaeologists, and a lot of people came into the field because of those movies, right? So you can as you say, the sword cuts both ways.
yeah, exactly. So let's give you one last question.
Shoot.
Tough one.
Wow. I mean, why do people prefer bullshit to the truth? Well, truth is limited by facts, right? You actually truth kind of has to make sense, and bullshit does not. So it's kind of like why is sometimes reading fiction? I'm a huge consumer of um genre fiction, of speculative fiction in general, sci-fi, horror, fantasy, all that stuff. I can't get enough of it. I do read fiction, obviously. It's my nonfiction. I write it, it's my job and all of that. But at the end of the day, when I want to kick back and relax, I'm sorry, I don't grab a copy I can't even think of a nonfiction book to say that I'm going to grab and crack open, right? It's you can write enjoyable nonfiction books, and you can write for a general audience from an expert perspective, but it's not easy, and not a lot of people do it. Whereas I think it is probably, I don't know, I'm going to get a lot of people mad at me for saying this, but I think it's probably easier to write engaging fiction than engaging nonfiction, just because you've got a lot more options of places that your narrative can go.
Yeah, I think that might be part of it. I think so. What's becoming more popular these days is kind of narrative nonfiction. And I was telling you beforehand how I'm trying to work a bit of that into my book on Atlantis, right? Because what you do is you have like a character in a sense, and that some emotional appeal and some dialogue and whatnot. Most
We like
nonfiction,
stories about people. We
yeah,
don't like
yeah,
stories
yeah,
about
exactly.
dispersonal facts. We like a narrative about an interesting person. And if you can piggyback facts on that human narrative, people will go along with you much
Yeah.
more than they will if you just talk at them
Which, by
about
the way, Graham is an expert at that. You
yeah,
read his books, and he does a great job when he goes to Baalbek. He describes his trip to Baalbek, and it's exciting and adventurous. And, he has a goal in mind, and he wants to prove his hypothesis. And so it really puts you in the moment. It's good writing. And so,
yeah, and he leans into that David versus Goliath. I've explained, talking about big archaeology as a Goliath is hilarious to anybody who's actually in the business. But he certainly makes a lot of hay out of playing the underdog. I
yeah.
think, as well, or claiming, canceling, and so forth, like you said before. Yeah.
And I think that's part of a problem in how we're trained how to write. I think
Yep.
we need to, in grad school and undergrad even, we need to be trained how to
So
write
much.
with
Yeah.
less big words, shorter
Yeah. Yeah.
sentences, maybe some more first person,
Yeah. We're not
appeals
all
and stuff
Michel
like that.
Foucault, and we shouldn't try to be. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that's really important that we start teaching people and scholars, future
Well,
scholars,
we
how
don't
to do
teach,
that.
we don't learn how to write, and we don't learn how to teach. And
Yeah.
then we're thrown into a field where we write and teach. And then
Yes, exactly.
we wonder why the outcomes aren't always ideal,
I
Um
was trained a little bit how to teach. We had
I,
regular
I
monthly, at least, pedagogy sessions for our grad school cohort.
you're lucky.
So, yeah,
I was just thrown into the pool, and
yeah.
luckily I could swim, as it turns out, but a lot of people can't,
But writing, no. And this is a big issue. And it really limits our ability to appeal to the public because we're not taught how to do that. What I found is that a lot of scholars have that ability after years of teaching to be able to present, in particular, not to write, but to present. And so
Yeah.
one of my big goals is to try to get every single scholar to just make one YouTube video of their best intro level teaching lecture.
Oh,
If you
that's a
see what
great
I mean.
idea.
If everybody did one YouTube video
Yeah.
once a year of their like best stuff, and we put together a platform to host those, I swear we could flood the internet with some really compelling, interesting, not too
You
obscure
know,
because it's intro level
with
type
your
stuff.
permission, Flint, I'm going to steal that idea. As a department chair, I actually have a limited amount of authority to make people do stuff, you know. Not really authority, but I could put if they've already got something in the can, you know, and
Yeah,
they'd be
yeah,
willing to put
exactly.
something out there, then you know, that's a great idea. And I'm going to see if I can follow up on that.
Do that. This is one of my goals. Every time I give my lectures on public engagement to colleagues, I'm like, look, and don't do it with your research, because your research is so difficult to
It's so that
contextualize.
we're so
And
hyper specific on the
yeah,
stuff that. Am I going to talk about how a gas chromatograph works? You know, who
no, no.
cares?
And so
I
do
barely
it
care. It's
on
my job.
from your 101 class, whatever
Yeah,
ones you teach. Pick
yeah,
one of your best lectures that students really vibe with, that teaches a bit about how the field works. It could involve a little bit of your research, but usually it'll have a case study or two from colleagues. And then boom, if you can just translate that into a YouTube video or a podcast, me and others, I'm sure, would be very willing to boost these. And
yeah,
so, like they'd start getting viewership if a lot of us did that. And then everybody has a different lecture in their back pocket. So it's a lot of different topics, a lot of different
yeah,
personalities, a lot of different points of view and voices. And it's like, I think we could really take over the internet if all of us just did one lecture a year.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We got to make learning, reading, being aware of things cool again.
Yes. And we're pretty good at that in our classrooms. After we've taught for 5 years, we've taught
Yeah,
the same class a few times. We get pretty good, most of us, not all of us. There's still some bad teachers out there, but in today's world, I think most of us are pretty decent teachers. And we
yeah,
usually have a few things that we can teach really well, maybe other things we teach a little less well. And so, I think we got to leverage that. And this is one of my big goals. I'll be mentioning this at the SAAs when I'm there, and I just mentioned
oh,
it
terrific.
yesterday. I mention it every time I give a lecture on this stuff, and I just think so. Good. I'm glad I got you hooked.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea.
Okay, so any last questions for Sean? This is last call for questions. Do you have any last points you want to make or anything like that on
I
ways
mean,
people can
not
go about
really. I
stuff?
mean, I just, you know, I think that probably the people who are tuning in are pretty down with what we're putting out there. You know, I guess what I would say is, again, have sympathy for the people who have been fooled, and try to shed some light on the big fish and the people who are platforming them. And just to go back before, this is not just, you know, a harmless puff piece kind of belief that you can slide in at the end of a newscast, ha ha ha, before you cut to weather or something like that. These are serious questions that affect, you know, the real perception of the history of real people, and it affects how people think about reality, which then affects everything they do in their life. So it's a bigger deal than most people think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, one of the points I always bring up is every decision we make on an individual or collective level
It
is
all adds
informed by
up.
history.
Yeah,
It's all informed by history. You decide, if you're in the stock market, you decide which stocks to buy based on the history of their performance. If
yep,
you're a politician, you decide what to do in the face of a public health crisis based on the history of research on the history of public health stuff. Same thing with everything is decided from history. So if we're getting history wrong, that impacts the decisions we all make on an individual and collective level. So like, it really friggin' matters, like
absolutely.
to not beat around the bush. The decisions
Well,
people
you
make are
know,
based on this.
I opened the book with a quote from Rage Against the Machine by way of Orwell, by way of Rage Against the Machine. If you control the past, you control the future, or some version of that, right? Controlling the narrative about the past is a way of controlling people in the here and now.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of manipulation that people are often not aware of and are very easy. It is therefore very easy to fall victim to it.
Yeah, I agree. All right, we have one last question from you, and it is, what myth do you think is the most harmful?
Wow, I think I would probably have to go in with the last one I cover. I mean, of the ones that I cover, at least. I can't claim any kind of global knowledge of all the ways that history's been misused. I think the way that like a discussion of one little Near Eastern language group called Aryan languages, how that became the foundation for one of the most grotesque miscarriages of justice in all of modern human history. Probably that would have to take the winner for most harmful myth.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. We have one less. Well, it's serious, but it's not like serious in the weighty way. Just because this just came in after I asked you, what's your favorite sci-fi and speculative fiction authors?
I just saw that on the corner. I'm going to say Ian M. Banks with the Culture
Ian
series.
Thanks. All right, great. Cool. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Rafferty, for stopping by. I hope I'll have you on again in the future. We can talk next time more about the archaeological evidence for intoxicating substances, because one of the myths that I find that really annoys me is all these pseudoscientists talk about intoxicating substances all the time, and they really frig it up. There's all sorts of really excellent research on people getting high in the past. And these people sell BS on this. And it's like they ignore all the actual evidence. And it's like, come on.
I would be so down for that. Yeah. I mean, that's I haven't been doing a lot of active research in that area in the past, but I've got a lot, under my belt for that. And look at that as a teaser for a future discussion. I would so be there for that.
Yeah, definitely, because I already have a couple of videos on my own research on this, and I have more to do at some point. But I'm fascinated by the topic because when I was a student, it was a very taboo topic. And it still sort of is, but not as much. But we now, with more recent science and stuff like that, with residue analysis like you've done, and more archaeobotany and pollen and various things, we now have a much clearer sense of it. And so I think we're going to do this. We're going to have you on again, and we're going to dig into some of the American evidence, because I don't know the American evidence very well at all. So I'm very intrigued to hear it.
I don't know the European Mediterranean evidence all that well, so that'd be terrific.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. And to everyone else, I will stick around. I mean, you can stick around too, Sean, but I'll stick around and do a quick Ask Me Anything. And and if anybody wants to ask me questions, I saw a lot of questions about politics. Look, just as a generic answer, I will try to stay away from politics in general, not because I don't think it's really important. I really do. And it really matters. And I imagine my politics are probably obvious and visible. But I find that so much of the discourse in today's world is really just meant to grab people's attention. And what that does is it distracts us from what's actually happening behind the scenes. So responding to a lot of modern politics and the last week of discourse is crazy. It's not
just
worth it.
Monkeys screaming at each other.
It's just people screaming, and we don't know what's actually going to have an impact on our lives. I will say that what really upsets me is what looks like funding cuts for science and for education and for scholarship, and that really worries me as an American and someone who would like to go back to America at some point. It's like that's really scary because look, I'm a scholar. This is what our modern world is founded upon, is good knowledge and good evidence and good theories, and if we're cutting that, it's a problem. So yeah. And then, of course, the villainization of science is another big issue. And I will be having some future guests on to talk more precisely about the villainization of scientists in general. Some people who are publishing books on this right now. I'm not going to.
Yeah, you hear about. I mean, like they've taken the security detail off of Anthony Fauci. I mean, just stuff like that. You're just unconscionable. I don't know.
Yeah,
like you said, I wouldn't want to talk about that just because I very quickly end up in a place where I just can't talk about anything. At that point. It's all too overwhelming for me at this point.
It's overwhelming, and also I've made a pact, since I do more public stuff, is to try to stick as much as possible to my expertise, because otherwise I'm just giving my opinion on stuff.
100%.
And so what I will try to do,
what can I do? I can do this, and I can do this. That's my job. keep doing your job.
And especially in the public, if I just start giving my opinion on X, Y, or Z that's not as informed, then
yeah,
I'm potentially giving false information. And so,
right. And then
and
someone will
that's why
find that
I'll
out,
have
and then
a,
that helps them.
yeah.
This so-called expert doesn't know what he's talking about. And yeah.
So I will intend to have on some physicians and some climate scientists. In fact, I'll have a physician on Friday, but it's not about
Terrific.
vaccines or anything like that. It's someone here in Cardiff, Dr. Matthew Morgan. He's published some books on animals and how they inform modern medical science. And
Interesting.
also he has a new one out where he talks about understanding death and grappling with death.
Oh, cool.
And so the book just came out, and so we'll have him on. He's a friend of mine, and so that'll be fun. We did get a couple questions. This one could be for either of us. From a longtime listener, MeatEater23. I have a question. Which one is more responsible for the spread of pseudo-archaeology? Is it the mainstream media failed to spread real archaeology, or the alt history figure like Graham or von Daniken? That's a tough one. I'd say
I'm not
both.
sure it's an either or. I mean,
Yeah.
those are both, those both factors are like that together. The mainstream media looks at a von Daniken or a Hancock and they see dollar signs. I could like the narrative is prepackaged. You don't have to pay a writer. It writes itself practically. And let's not leave ourselves out of it. I've already made the point, and Flint has as well, that so many academics, for understandable reasons in many cases, but they generally don't take it upon themselves to interact with the public all that much. The ivory tower myth exists for a reason. Not a lot of us are incentivized to come down from it and talk about what we do to the people who, ultimately pay for all of this, at least if you're, a tax-funded academic as I am. So I think that those are, I'm not sure I could say and either or. They're both actively contributing to the situation we're in right now. Flint, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with all three as well. I find that our colleagues are really, really good at outreach for children. We suck
Yeah.
at outreach for adults. And it's like we need to learn how to communicate with smart people who might
Sure.
not have as much of an education as us, and definitely don't have the experience and expertise as us. And we need to do a much better job at that. We're good at that when we have a captive audience, like undergrad students in our class all
who
semester
have to be
long.
there.
And but we need to really start teaching ourselves these skills. And I always tell everybody we need to incentivize it. We need to make sure that actually is part of hiring and promotion at the university higher education level, because it's not
see
right
a lot
now.
of lip service for it.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's more just that. One of the best talks I ever gave was actually in a bar where they had
me too.
we had a program where we would bring scientists out to local bars and you would give a 20-minute talk on a subject about something to people who were hanging out having dinner and so forth. Meet the people where they're at. Not for everybody, and you got to have you got to kind of know what you're doing. As you say, you got to get some practice at talking from an informed expert position while not coming off like a pretentious jerk, as some of us maybe need more practice at.
Yeah, exactly. We have a quick question we can answer here from We Are DNA. How far does digging go? I mean, hundreds of thousands of years of Homo sapiens have been buried. So look, in general, most projects will dig down until they are at bedrock, where there's literally no more human artifacts left. So we know that we are in a natural layer where that environment, that landscape was used, not by humans. And we test that extensively, where we will keep digging into that natural layer. Let's say it's a natural soil layer rather than bedrock, to test that, to make sure there's not a separation there. And in fact, sometimes when it's bedrock, we'll even test it. I've worked on at Neanderthal sites, rock shelters and caves in France. And, we tested that the cave floor was the cave floor and not part of the rock shelter collapse from the ceiling. And so we got out jackhammers and we tested it. And so, our goal there might be practical reasons why we can't go down any further. Let's say we hit like a Greek temple and we don't want to destroy that temple by digging underneath it, right?
Right.
So there might be safety issues if you're going down too far. Or there might be financial reasons we can't keep digging because our funding is up.
Yep.
So there are reasons, but on average, we try to go down to the very bottom of any human or hominid occupation at archaeological site and we test that if we can. So that's, if you have anything you want to add, you can.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we'll dig down to what we call, sterile soils, not like in a biologically sterile, but a culturally sterile sense. How do you know that? I mean, where I dig, I mean, I've never worked in the old world, so in certainly in northeastern North America, almost all of my work's been in New York State, right? So at this point, if you hit glacial soils, the gravels that were left here by the glaciers, if you find something in that, you're famous now because you've just discovered, pre-Pleistocene evidence of humans. That you're pretty much that there's really no way you're going to find anything below that. But again, as Flint mentions, archaeology is a business that has OSHA safety issues, and got to be paid for. I am often working with unpaid student labor who pay me for the pleasure of being in my field school, learning how to do archaeology. And there's an issue of, an untrained person can only get so much done if you're training them while they're doing your excavation for you. So there's a lot of factors that come up. But again, yeah, we want to get everything that we possibly can within the various pragmatic restrictions that we face.
And then most archaeology is not done by scholars. So we were just describing an academic excavation. Most of it's commercial for infrastructure projects or for architectural, someone's going to build a building or construction. And so in that case, the excavation area is defined by the parameters of where the construction is going to go. So I've worked on some of these projects in Greece, and, we had to go down further into sterile soil because that's where the columns for this roof on this really important site were going to be. And we had to be sure that there's nothing there. And so that's defined again by more modern parameters of exactly the layout for the foundations of a building or an infrastructure project or whatever. So that's how these decisions are made. Graham Hancock is popularized. It's one of the few things where I think I'm not sure if he came up with this idea or if somebody else did, but it's an outright lie that North American archaeologists stopped digging at the Clovis layer. Never would we stop digging because we're in a Clovis layer, because there might be another Clovis layer underneath even. There's not just one Clovis layer.
And because if I find a pre-Clovis layer, that publication writes itself at that point, especially now that the scientific environment is much more amenable to what the data actually says than it was back in the 70s. I think, absolutely. What possible motivation would I have for ignoring what would be the find of a lifetime on a site that
exactly.
I'm working on?
This is one of the most pernicious lies on the internet, is that archaeologists just want to keep the same narrative. It's like, no, we want to find new stuff to publish something new and change the narrative and put our name on it. That is what our goal is.
Who hypothetically is enforcing this? Is like, does like a tree undress itself and say that there are someone I'm from the World Archaeological Council and I'm here to stop you from excavating now that you've hit that Clovis point. It's just, if you look at the details, like they make a claim and then you're like, well, how would that work exactly?
Yeah.
And you look like, there's no way that could possibly work. Like even if that was the gig, it's unenforceable.
Of course, but that's the nature of conspiracy theories. That's the nature of conspiracy theories, that we're all in a conspiracy together.
How many of us are in on, I mean, okay, fine. So there's 5,000 archaeologists in America. I made that number up. It's probably not too far off, though. All of us are being, lockstep silent about keeping this narrative.
Even the ones who quit the field in anger, which are many of them. Yeah.
It would be laughable if so many people didn't find it superficially convincing.
Yeah. To get back to another question, I'm just going to pawn it off and say, Sabine, It's a really good question. What's some of the best evidence we found for superstition? But I bet you with me and Sean, this will be a topic that we talk about when we talk about intoxicating substances.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
mean, I guess we'd have to get into like define your terms. What do you mean by superstition and so forth? I mean, if you're talking about, general kind of irrational, non-factual beliefs, I mean, you could under some definitions lump any kind of religious expression under that term, right? And a lot of the use of drugs are explicitly religious in focus. But this, I'll give you something we were looking for. I was working this summer with my colleague Chris Wolf at a 19th century site in just near campus, and it's a standing foundation, and we were actually trying to find the doorway, and we wanted to excavate under the doorway to see if they buried anything under their doorway, which was not an uncommon practice at the time to put some kind of a patropaic magic to ward off any kind of perceived evil was not, super uncommon. At the time, we thought these were fairly recent immigrants from Germany. We found out that was later a misreading of historic documents on someone else's part. But for example, you find a bottle buried under your foundation and it's got pins in it or something. That's a witch bottle that's supposed to ward off various kinds of malign factors. I've never found something like that. I would sure love to, though, to the point that I look for it if I have the opportunity, stuff like that.
yeah, I'll save this for some drug stories because they're fun.
Absolutely.
So I guess we have another one from Avery. Explain how the only 5% has been explored argument does not work. Do you want to go? I've done this several times. I can jump in afterwards.
I mean, I'm
Wait. Actually, wait a second. Yeah, just to clarify what this is, this comes from the debate I had with Graham Hancock, where Hancock is saying, well, if only 5% of the desert has been explored, how can we say there's no lost civilization there? And so it's a really stupid argument that shows a lack of understanding of how archaeology works in the first place, because it's all based around sampling anyway, which, to be honest, almost all sciences are. Biologists don't count every single species in an area, they sample it. Astronomers, they have to sample the night sky based on where they can point telescopes at it and extrapolate. Every single science is based upon sampling, and archaeology is no less. And to talk about the Sahara, God, most major sites only have like 10% of them excavated, because we're always leaving more work for future archaeologists anyway.
It's actually kind of malpractice to excavate an entire site unless there's some, I mean, I suppose maybe if the site's going to be destroyed by construction, but even then there's usually pragmatic cost reasons why you can't do that. I would say, 5% is actually plenty if there was evidence, given the fact of how messy humans are and how much trash we leave on the landscape, especially when we're living there in large populations in settled cities of the sort that this ancient civilization hypothesis requires, then that within that 5% would be the evidence if it was there. That's sort of my off the cuff response to that.
Yeah, and I mean, as I mentioned several times in the debate, well, if we have tens of thousands of sites of hunter-gatherers from underwater, from the coast, from the deserts, from the rainforests, but none from this giant global advanced civilization.
They were a very tidy people, Flint. They recycled, they reuse, take only pictures, leave only footprints. That was their governing ideology. It's very close-minded of you.
No, and the point is our sample is actually quite large. And, it also is not just excavation. It includes all forms of survey, which is really important, because we were arguing about this about the Sahara Desert.
Yeah, what about the remote sensing? What about the aerial
what
surveys?
about remote sensing or surface survey? Like most areas of the desert, there's not most, but huge expanses of desert, there's a lot of wind erosion that happens. And so what that means is ancient landscapes are actually on the surface. And so you can walk through this and find thousands of Ice Age period archaeological sites in the Sahara Desert. Someone I know is doing a survey right now outside of Luxor, and she's posting photos on Blue Sky every day of lithic surfaces My dad
Yeah.
has done a survey outside of Abydos. One of my good friends has just done a survey of the Namib Desert. I'm going to have him on YouTube at some point. And so, yeah, there's all this survey and LiDAR, as you mentioned, and other kinds of survey that shows us what's going on. We actually have a good coverage. We have really good coverage.
Yeah, again, that's part of like playing on like the 5% sounds small until an expert actually puts it in an actual context for you.
Yeah.
It's one of those where like it's one of those, well, they've only dug 5% of the ground. That's a category of fact I call true but misleading, because it is not necessarily wrong, but the way you're divorcing it from the context of what we do and how we do it leads you to a false conclusion.
Yes, exactly. All right, we're going to do one last question from Captain Pandora. When excavating, do you ever think about curses?
I was hoping I saw this one come up. Yeah. What's your take on curses, Flint?
Me, no. I'm not a very superstitious person. I am concerned about disturbing burials, though. That is a person.
That is a hugely thorny ethical issue
yeah.
as someone who works in Indigenous America in particular, but I'm sure it's always a fraught issue. I mean, on the rare occasions where I have excavated human burials, and it's been, one hand I can count them, but I try to keep it in my head. This was a person who had a family and a name and a favorite food and all of that kind of stuff, that it was somebody just like you or me, and to use all of that kind of respect in doing the necessary work. And these were always situations where today we do a lot of consulting with indigenous populations who have claims to the land that we're working on in various ways, and make sure that their wishes are honored to the greatest degree possible as well. As far as like actual curses, he who disturbs my tomb shall suffer 1,000 deaths or something like that. I've never had the pleasure of finding anything like that. Again, I think that would be kind of awesome if I did, because of the window that would give me into the mindset of ancient people, right? To not, I have no concerns of my own. I always think of that Onion cartoon, archaeologists tired of unearthing ancient evils or something. But I would like to learn about what people in the past believed, not just what they ate or how they made tools, what they thought. And that would be information about what they thought. That's kind of where I come down on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've actually excavated several burial contexts in the Greek and Roman world. And I mean, in addition to keeping in the kind of weighty thing that this is a human, another key thing to understand is that most burial contexts are fairly unique in that they're what we call a primary deposit.
Yeah,
so much of what we dig is just kind of like scatters of trash, right? And or leveling fill to build a building or something like that. But when you're dealing with a primary context, whether it's a burial or something else, you have to always approach it more carefully in terms of documentation, because there's a certain, you want to capture the intentionality of how things were left behind in those primary contexts. So even our methods change in that sense as soon as we hit something like a burial. A burial is going to have its own set of different methods as well, because you're trying to do a series of recordings of the position of the body and the grave goods and whatever. Or if it's a commingled burial, I've excavated a crypt in a medieval church in Ukraine, and it's just a series of commingled skeletons. We were very, very carefully doing three-dimensional documentation so that the people who studied those skeletons later could say that these bones belonged with this person and those bones belonged with that person, to be able to understand the context better. And so, for a wide variety of reasons, for ethical as well as scientific, we treat burials very different, and legal issues as well, of course. So that would be my argument there. Okay, I think we've answered most of the pertinent questions. I'm sorry if I missed any. I do need to go because it's getting late here and I got to eat.
Terrific.
So it was really great to meet you over this platform, Sean, and I'll have you on again to talk about intoxicating
Yeah, I mean,
substances.
if anybody if anybody ever has any questions about what we've been talking about, I'm really easy to get a hold of. You can, if you Google Sean Rafferty and Albany, you'll find my faculty website, which is just srafferty@albany.edu. And if you email me a question, I 100% will respond.
Great. I won't always because so many people email me random questions now.
One's more famous than I am. I'll say this now. We'll see. Well, hopefully someday I have the ability to say I can't possibly respond to all of you, but for the now I can't. So love
I
to
have
hear
a
from
very strong spam filter as well for that reason. So I
you.
don't
I'm
even
sure you
always
must.
see all the emails I get. But
Yeah.
so I apologize if anyone sent me a nice email because there's several probably that I've not replied to, and I apologize. But yes, cool. This was a great conversation. It's great to be back for 2025, everybody. We'll do a lot more of these live streams now that I have some of this new software and a new computer set up for this, and expect regular conversations with colleagues and experts on all these really cool topics. So tune in with Archaeology with Flint and share it. Share this because it's recorded and available for people who missed it. So cool. Thank you all.
Bye bye.